Grace Miller paused in front of the pawn shop, her fingers wrapped tightly around her father's gold ring. She'd been holding onto it for nearly an hour now, lingering outside the shop with a hesitation that was unlike her. The ring felt solid in her hand, heavy, warm from her touch, and achingly familiar. It was the last valuable thing her family owned, and in a way, it felt like the last piece of her father's legacy she still held. She could hardly bring herself to imagine the moment she'd have to release it. Her father, John Miller, had always worn the ring with pride. She remembered seeing it on his hand as a child, her little fingers tracing the band's intricate patterns, and later on, learning about the initials engraved inside, "To John Love Always, Mary." The letters had faded over time, but she knew the story behind them as clearly as if she'd been there herself. It was a gift from her mother, Mary, who had passed away years ago. The ring was more than just a band of gold. It was a bond, a piece of her parents' love, something she'd always thought would stay with her forever. And now, here she was, standing outside a dingy pawn shop, about to sell it to pay for her father's treatment. The thought felt impossible, yet here she was. Taking a deep breath, Grace forced herself to push open the door. A small bell tinkled as she stepped inside, and the sound seemed to echo in the otherwise quiet shop. The place was dim, crowded with shelves and glass cases full of other people's valuables. Watches, jewelry, coins, each item holding its own story of loss or desperation. She suddenly felt a pang of kinship with them, realizing she was joining the silent ranks of those who had no other choice. Behind the counter stood a man she recognized from a few visits she'd made to pawn other items. Robert Clark, a tall, lean man with graying hair and cold, calculating eyes. He was someone she would have avoided if she'd had the luxury. Robert glanced up as she approached, his gaze sliding from her face down to the ring in her hand, his interest piqued. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his voice as smooth as his practiced smile, a look that barely disguised his curiosity. He folded his arms over the counter, leaning forward slightly as if to take a closer look. Grace hesitated, feeling her throat tighten. She didn't want to be here, she didn't want to do this. But there was no other choice. "I'd like to sell this," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She placed the ring gently on the counter, her fingers lingering on it, unwilling to let go. The weight of this choice pressed on her as she finally pulled her hand away, leaving the ring alone on the cold glass. Robert picked up the ring, holding it up to the light, examining it with an expression that was a mixture of appreciation and detached indifference. He turned it over, studying the faint inscription, his eyes narrowing slightly as if calculating its worth in his head. His face betrayed nothing, just a blank expression of someone who had seen and handled hundreds of items like this before. For him, this was just another trinket, something he could buy low and sell high. "Not bad," he murmured, inspecting the ring with a quick, appraising glance. "Gold, nice craftsmanship," he noted, more to himself than to her. He looked up, his gaze sharp and assessing. "I can give you $200 for it. That's the best I can do." Grace felt her stomach drop at the number. $200. It was almost insulting. She stared at him, her heart sinking as she tried to mask her disappointment. She'd hoped for at least twice that, if not more. This ring wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was an heirloom, a piece of her father's life, of her parents' love. How could he not see that? "That's it?" she asked, unable to keep the edge of disbelief out of her voice. It's an antique. It's worth more than that." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the desperation she'd been trying so hard to hide. Robert raised an eyebrow, his expression unfazed. He leaned back, crossing his arms as he looked down at her, his mouth curving into a slight, dismissive smile. "Look, miss, it might mean something to you, but to me, it's just another piece of gold with an old engraving. Sentimental value doesn't pay the bills, and the market's tough right now." He shrugged, barely disguising his impatience. "$200, take it or leave it. I don't have all day." Grace bit her lip, feeling a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over her. She knew he was taking advantage of her situation. He could see her desperation as clearly as he could see the ring in his hand. But what could she do? She was out of options. Every other item she'd owned of value was already gone. This was the last thing she could sell, and even though $200 wouldn't cover more than a fraction of her father's medical bills, it was better than nothing. She had to make every cent stretch. After a moment, she lowered her gaze, her voice barely audible. "Fine," she whispered, feeling as though each letter of the word cost her a piece of herself. "I'll take it." Robert nodded, clearly satisfied. Without another word, he turned to his register and began counting out the money, his movements brisk and businesslike. Grace watched him lay out the bills, her heart sinking with each one. When he finally finished, he placed the money on the counter, pushing it toward her. "There you go," he said flatly, his tone as empty as his expression. "Best of luck." She felt a lump rise in her throat as she reached out to take the cash. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, the worn bills feeling thin and insubstantial in her hands. She knew it wasn't nearly enough, that it wouldn't make a dent in the tidal wave of medical expenses looming over her, but she had no other choice. This was all she had now. Grace cast one last, lingering look at the ring lying on the counter. In that moment, she felt as though she were leaving behind a part of herself, something she could never get back. The ring was a connection to her father's past, to her family's history, and now it was gone, left behind in the hands of a man who couldn't care less about its significance. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the shop, the bell chiming faintly behind her as the door swung shut. She didn't look back, but the weight of what she'd just done felt like a stone in her chest, each step she took carrying her further away from a part of her own story. That evening, Grace sat in the cozy kitchen of her best friend, Susan Davis, her fingers tracing aimless patterns on the worn tabletop. Her mind felt numb, lost somewhere between sadness and guilt. She finally let out a long breath and broke the silence that had settled between them. "I sold Dad's ring," Grace confessed, her voice so quiet it barely made it across the table. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, as if she were still seeing that ring lying on the counter, just out of her reach. Susan's face softened as she watched her friend struggle with the weight of her choice. She reached across the table, taking Grace's hand in hers, offering a gentle, comforting squeeze. "Grace, you did what you had to do," she said, her voice steady. "Your dad would understand. He'd want you to do whatever it took to help him." She paused, searching Grace's face for any flicker of reassurance, but all she saw was pain. Grace closed her eyes, the faintest shadow of relief flickering across her face. But it was quickly replaced by the helplessness that had haunted her for weeks. "I know he would, but it was the last thing of real value we had," she whispered. "And the worst part is, even that barely helps us. The bills just keep coming, and I'm running out of things to sell." Susan let out a sigh, her thumb tracing circles over Grace's hand. "Have you talked to Dr. Harris about some kind of payment plan? He knows the situation. Maybe he'd be willing to work something out with you." Grace shook her head, looking away. "He's already done so much for us, Susan," she murmured. "He's reduced his fees, arranged for samples of Dad's medication, anything he could. I just can't ask for more. It feels like I'm taking advantage of his kindness." Susan was silent for a moment, nodding slowly as she absorbed her friend's words. She understood. Grace's pride was as strong as her heart, always careful not to cross the line from asking for help into accepting charity. But Susan also knew that Grace was at the edge of what she could handle alone. "Grace," Susan said softly, meeting her friend's eyes, "sometimes we have to let people help us, even when it feels like we're asking too much. Especially then. No one can do this alone." Her voice was warm, urging her friend to see the strength in leaning on others, to understand that the people around her genuinely wanted to help. Before Grace could respond, Susan continued, "You know, I've been thinking about Dad too." She glanced at her friend with an encouraging look, sharing a story from her own experience. "Remember when my mom was sick, and I had to borrow money from Aunt Lorraine? I felt horrible, like I was failing somehow. But she wanted to help, Grace. She wanted to be there for me. I think Dr. Harris is the same. He sees what you're going through, and he wants to help you. That's just who he is." Grace managed a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Susan. Really." She paused, trying to steady her emotions. I didn't think it would ever come to this. Not with Dad. I thought we had more time." Susan squeezed her hand a little tighter, her own voice wavering. "I know, Grace. And I know how hard this is. But your dad's lucky to have you. You're doing everything you can, and that's more than most people could bear." They sat together in silence, the quiet a testament to their friendship, each knowing the other's burdens without needing to speak. Grace felt some of the tension lift from her shoulders, the smallest bit of comfort in Susan's unwavering support. Strich. The next morning, Grace was jolted awake by a loud thump on her front porch. Still groggy, she stumbled to the door and found a thick, cream-colored envelope lying on the doormat. Her heart skipped a beat as she picked it up, a sense of unease twisting in her stomach. She hadn't been expecting any mail, certainly nothing that looked so official. With a furrowed brow, she broke the seal and unfolded a crisp, formal letter from someone named Michael Turner. The letter was brief, but it packed a punch. Mr. Turner was an attorney representing an unnamed client who urgently wished to meet with her. It wasn't the kind of thing she received every day, or any day for that matter. She reread the words, trying to make sense of them, but they only deepened her curiosity and confusion. Sitting on her bed, she stared at the letter, its vagueness feeling both mysterious and unsettling. She couldn't think of anyone who would go through an attorney just to speak with her, especially someone who considered it urgent. Her heart began to race as questions flooded her mind. Was this about her father? Or perhaps something left unresolved in her mother's passing? She'd spent years learning to navigate crises, but this felt different, like an unknown door was about to open, one she wasn't sure she wanted to cross. Finally, after minutes of deliberation, Grace picked up her phone and dialed the number on the letter, her hand trembling slightly as she listened to the dial tone. On the third ring, a warm, professional voice answered. Turner and Associates. How may I assist you? Grace hesitated, her voice catching in her throat. Yes. My name is Grace Miller. I received a letter from Mr. Turner, something about a meeting. Of course, Ms. Miller, the woman replied, her voice soft but efficient. I'm Linda Smith, Mr. Turner's assistant. He's been expecting your call. Can you come by our office this afternoon? Grace's eyes widened slightly at the urgency in Linda's tone. She hadn't anticipated things moving this quickly. Yes, I suppose I could be there. Around 3. That would be perfect, Linda replied smoothly, her tone friendly yet businesslike. Mr. Turner will be waiting for you. Grace ended the call, feeling her stomach twist with nervous anticipation. She had no idea who this attorney was, or why he was reaching out to her. But despite the question swirling in her mind, she found herself strangely drawn to the idea of going, almost as if some unseen force were pushing her forward. With no one to turn to for immediate answers, Grace could only wait. She glanced at the clock, counting down the hours to her appointment, feeling a sense of dread mixed with an unfamiliar flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, something was happening that wasn't simply a response to her father's illness. Whatever this meeting was about, it was something new, something unknown. The clock ticked on, and as the hours passed, her anticipation grew. Grace stepped into the law office, her pulse racing as she took in the imposing decor, a blend of polished wood and heavy leather chairs that gave the space a dignified air. Her fingers fidgeted at her side, still tense from her conversation with Linda, Mr. Turner's assistant, who had sounded both warm and guarded. She wondered again why a lawyer was reaching out to her. What urgent matter could this possibly be? Her thoughts were interrupted as a tall, well-dressed man appeared in the doorway of the office. He had an air of quiet authority, clean-cut, graying hair at the temples, a suit tailored to perfection. As he extended a firm hand, his gaze was both sharp and kind. Ms. Miller, thank you for coming, he said, his voice calm but deliberate. I'm Michael Turner. Please, take a seat. Grace settled into the chair he gestured to, feeling the weight of his presence as he moved behind his desk. He clasped his hands and leaned forward slightly, studying her with a look that was both serious and sympathetic. I realize this meeting might seem sudden, even confusing, he began, a note of empathy in his voice. But I assure you, it's of significant importance. You see, a client of ours recently came across an item that belongs to your family, or more accurately, to you. Grace's brows knitted together in bewilderment. She had no idea what he was talking about. Her family didn't have any long-lost treasures. Anything of value had already been pawned to cover bills and everyday expenses. She leaned forward, curiosity overtaking her nervousness. An item? She repeated, searching his face for answers. But who would have something of mine? Just as the question left her lips, the office door opened, and a man in his 30s walked in. He was tall, well-dressed, with a calm, open expression that contrasted with the seriousness of the office around him. His dark hair and piercing eyes gave him a certain elegance, and when he smiled, there was a kindness there that immediately put her at ease. Ms. Miller, he said, extending his hand warmly, I'm Ethan Anderson. I'm very glad to finally meet you. Grace shook his hand, still thoroughly puzzled. I don't understand. Why am I here? How could you possibly have something that belongs to me? Ethan offered her a gentle smile, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box and, with a careful glance at her, opened it to reveal the contents. There, nestled in the box's soft lining, was her father's ring, the same gold band she had sold just days earlier. The sight of it took her breath away. Grace's eyes widened, her gaze locked on the ring. That's my father's ring," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at Ethan, bewildered. "How did you buy this?" Ethan nodded, as if understanding her shock. "I did," he replied, his tone calm but steady. "I came across it in a small pawn shop downtown. I don't know what it was, but something about the ring just stood out to me." He paused, allowing her to absorb his words before continuing. "When I saw the engraving inside, 'To John, love always, Mary,' I was intrigued. You see, Mary was my mother's name." Grace's breath caught as she processed his words. She felt her heart begin to race, and for a moment, she was unsure if she was hearing him correctly. "Your mother's name? But how does that connect to me? To my father?" Ethan shifted, his expression gentle yet serious. "After seeing the inscription, I felt this nagging feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence. So I did some research," he explained, his voice calm but tinged with emotion. "After a few calls and a bit of digging, I found something that surprised me." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "It turns out, our families are connected. My mother, Mary, was your father's sister." Grace's eyes widened as she took in this revelation. Her mind raced as she pieced together the meaning behind his words. She looked at Ethan in stunned silence, her thoughts scrambling to make sense of this sudden connection. You're saying we're cousins?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. She couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Her father had never mentioned a sibling named Mary. Could this really be true? Ethan gave a soft nod, his gaze warm and reassuring. "Yes, Grace. We're family." Grace leaned back in her chair, her hand covering her mouth as she processed this news. 1,000 questions flooded her mind. Why had her father never mentioned this sister? Why had they been separated? She couldn't begin to grasp the implications, but a sense of awe, and perhaps even hope, began to well up inside her. Ethan's expression grew more serious as he continued, "I know this is a lot to take in, and it probably feels overwhelming. But when I found out about our connection, I felt compelled to reach out. You see, I want to help. I know that your father is going through a difficult time, and, well, I'm here to support you however I can." Grace was silent for a moment, a mix of emotions churning within her. She looked down at the ring, feeling a fresh wave of guilt at having sold it, even if it had been out of necessity. Now here was this man, this stranger, her cousin, offering to help her in ways she could never have anticipated. "Why would you want to help us?" she asked softly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "You didn't even know we existed until recently." Ethan's face softened. "Maybe I didn't know you, but that doesn't change the fact that we're family," he replied, his voice steady and sincere. "I've had a lot of privilege in my life, and when I saw how much this ring meant to you, to us, I knew that I wanted to do something meaningful. I want to help your father. And I want to get to know you." Grace felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Her life had been so filled with struggle, with fighting and sacrificing, that the idea of accepting help from a stranger, even if he was family, felt foreign, almost impossible. "Ethan, I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. She felt a mix of gratitude and vulnerability that was hard to express. We've been through so much, and I wasn't expecting any of this." Ethan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "You don't have to say anything, Grace," he said softly. "Just know that I'm here, and I want to help. We're in this together." A surge of emotion rose in Grace's chest, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the smallest glimmer of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face everything alone. Grace sat beside her father, John Miller, later that evening, still trying to wrap her mind around the revelation from her meeting with Ethan. She glanced at John, who sat propped up in his armchair, eyes closed, his breathing slow and steady. When she'd entered the room, she had hoped to break the news gently, but no matter how she'd prepared, she couldn't find a way to start. She knew, however, that he needed to hear it from her. "Dad," she began, her voice low but steady. John's eyes opened slowly, and he looked over at her, sensing the weight in her tone. "What's on your mind, Grace?" he asked, his gaze soft, knowing. There's something I need to tell you," she replied, choosing her words carefully. She paused, trying to ease into what felt like the most surprising news she'd ever had to share. Today, I met someone, a man named Ethan Anderson. John's brows knitted in slight confusion, but he stayed silent, encouraging her to go on. He's your nephew, Dad, she said, her voice trembling with the magnitude of her words. Ethan is Mary's son, your sister Mary. For a moment, John didn't respond, his expression unreadable. Grace's heart pounded as she watched him, unsure how he would react. Finally, after a long silence, he let out a quiet sigh, nodding slowly as though pieces of a long-forgotten puzzle were finally falling into place. Mary, he said softly, a distant look in his eyes. She left so long ago, Grace. I hadn't heard from her in years, not since we were both barely adults. I always wondered what happened to her, but I could never find any answers. He looked down, his voice breaking slightly. She was my only sibling. I thought about her often. Grace could see the sadness in his eyes, mingling with traces of old memories and quiet regret. She had a son, she continued gently, wanting him to see the possibilities in this news. And that son, he wants to help us. He offered to help with your medical bills. John's head shot up, his eyes sharpening at her words. No, Grace, he said firmly, shaking his head. I can't accept that. He doesn't know us. We're practically strangers. Dad, please, she urged, her voice cracking under the strain. We're barely keeping our heads above water. And Ethan, he's family. He's genuine. I can feel it. He just wants to help us. But John's expression was stubborn, his resolve hardened by years of pride and independence. I won't let him feel obligated to us just because of family ties he didn't ask for. This isn't his burden. Grace swallowed, taking a deep breath, struggling to find a way to make him understand. Dad, he doesn't feel obligated. I believe he genuinely wants to help, and he has the means to do it. We can't keep turning down help when we're running out of options. Please just think about it. John looked away, his face shadowed with hesitation. Finally, after a long silence, he gave a small nod, though his expression remained conflicted. Grace knew that it wasn't a victory, but it was a step, a chance for him to at least consider the possibility. Strich. The following afternoon, Ethan arrived at their home, this time with Linda by his side. They were both dressed neatly, and Linda held a thick folder of documents in her arms. Grace met them at the door, trying to keep her emotions steady. She didn't know how this would go, but a faint sense of hope flickered within her. Ethan offered her a warm smile as he stepped inside. I hope it's all right that I brought Linda along, he said. She's my assistant, but she's also been a friend to me for years. I thought she might be able to help answer any questions you or your father might have. Grace smiled back, relieved at the thoughtfulness of his approach. She led them into the living room, where John was waiting, his posture tense but his gaze steady as he regarded Ethan. They exchanged quiet introductions, and Grace could sense the undercurrent of respect between the two men. Ethan was calm and respectful, seeming to intuitively understand John's cautious pride. Ethan took a breath, breaking the silence. Mr. Miller, he began, his tone sincere, I know this is all new for you, and I want you to know that I didn't come here today to pressure you. I came because I believe families should support one another, and I'd like to offer that support, however you'd feel comfortable accepting it. John sat back, his expression guarded but contemplative. Ethan, I appreciate the sentiment, I truly do, he replied, a hint of reluctance in his voice. But I've lived my whole life trying to get by on my own. I don't want to burden anyone with my troubles, especially someone I've just met. Ethan nodded, acknowledging John's concerns with understanding. I understand, and I respect that. But please know that this offer isn't coming from a place of pity or obligation. It's coming from a desire to connect with family. He paused, his gaze unwavering. This ring, he gestured to the gold band resting on the table between them, brought us together. I believe it was meant to do so. I want to honor that connection. Let me help. Grace watched her father, her heart in her throat as he struggled to reconcile his pride with the overwhelming needs they faced. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. Dad, Ethan has already done so much by just reaching out to us. Can we let him be part of this with us? Just let him help. John looked between his daughter and Ethan, his expression finally softening as he let out a quiet sigh. All right, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. If you really want to help, then we'll accept it. But I won't let you cover everything. Just what's necessary." Ethan's face lit up with a grateful smile, and Linda stepped forward, offering John the documents in her arms. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," she said kindly. "We've already spoken to Dr. Harris, who's arranged for the best care possible under your circumstances. Ethan has taken care of the initial costs, but he would like you to know that everything will be transparent, and he'll keep you informed every step of the way." Relief washed over Grace, her shoulders relaxing as she listened to Linda's calm, reassuring words. It was the first time in a long while that she felt like they weren't alone, that there was a way out of the overwhelming burden they'd carried for so long. After a few more minutes of conversation, Ethan and Linda took their leave, with promises to follow up soon. As the door closed behind them, Grace turned to her father, who sat in silence, his gaze distant. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, feeling the weight of his decision, "for letting him in." John gave her a small, bittersweet smile. "I'm doing this for you, Grace. And maybe for Mary too." Grace nodded, understanding the complex emotions in his voice. And as she looked toward the future, she knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one filled with answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask. Several days passed in an almost surreal calm. Grace had begun to adjust to Ethan's presence in their lives, even finding comfort in the new sense of family he brought. Her father was finally receiving the care he needed, and for the first time in a long while, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. She was starting to believe that maybe things were finally turning around. Then one morning, her phone rang, pulling her back from her cautious optimism. Glancing at the unfamiliar number on the screen, Grace hesitated before answering. "Hello, this is Grace Miller," she said, her voice tentative. "Ms. Miller, this is Detective Laura Bennett with the District Police Department," replied a steady, calm voice on the other end of the line. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she processed the words, unease creeping in. Why would a detective be calling her? "Oh, detective," she stammered, trying to collect herself. "How can I help you?" Detective Bennett wasted no time, her tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Ms. Miller, I'm contacting you regarding an ongoing investigation involving the owner of a pawn shop you recently visited, Robert Clark. We have reason to believe Mr. Clark is involved in the trafficking of stolen goods and may be targeting individuals facing financial hardships." Grace felt a jolt at the mention of Robert Clark's name. Her thoughts shot back to her father's ring, to the strained, almost predatory look in Robert's eyes as he had coolly offered her far less than its value. It had been a desperate transaction for her, one she'd done out of necessity, not choice. She took a breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Yes, I sold him something. My father's ring. But I had no idea he was involved in anything illegal," Grace said, her voice barely steady. Detective Bennett seemed to pick up on her distress. "I understand this is difficult to hear," she said, her tone softening. "We believe Mr. Clark may have been exploiting vulnerable individuals, knowingly taking advantage of those in dire situations. We've been gathering evidence for some time, and we're reaching out to people he's done business with who may have insight or information that could help our case. Would you be willing to speak with us further?" Grace felt a mixture of anger and nausea rise up within her. The idea that Robert Clark had likely been preying on others like her, profiting from their desperation, it felt like an injustice too cruel to ignore. For her, the decision was immediate. "Yes, I want to help," she replied firmly, her voice gaining strength. "I'll do whatever I can to help bring him to justice." "Thank you, Ms. Miller," Detective Bennett said, sounding genuinely appreciative. "Your cooperation could be crucial. I'd like to meet with you to go over details of your experience with Mr. Clark and to provide some guidance on next steps. I'll make sure we do this as smoothly and comfortably as possible." Grace's thoughts raced as she agreed to a meeting with the detective. Ending the call, she sat back in her chair, feeling a wave of memories come rushing back. Memories of standing in that pawn shop, the helplessness she'd felt, the ache of selling a piece of her family history for next to nothing. Now she understood why the experience had felt so unsettling. Robert Clark hadn't just been indifferent, he'd been knowingly taking advantage of her at her most vulnerable. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Ethan stepped into the room, noticing the troubled look on her face. "Grace? Are you all right?" he asked, his concern immediate and genuine. Grace looked up, her eyes still wide with shock. "I just got a call from a detective," she began, her voice shaking slightly as she relayed the news. "Robert Clark. He's under investigation." They believe he's been dealing in stolen goods, taking advantage of people like me, people who are desperate. Ethan's expression hardened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. That's despicable, he said quietly, his voice full of intensity. The thought of someone using your vulnerability against you like that. Grace, if there's anything I can do to support you in this, I'm here. Grace managed a small, grateful smile. Thank you, Ethan. It means a lot to have you here. She paused, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. I want to do something. I need to help put an end to this. Ethan nodded, his expression resolute. Then we'll do it. You're not alone in this, Grace. The day of the police operation arrived, and Grace could feel every nerve in her body on edge as she prepared to walk into Robert Clark's pawn shop for what she hoped would be the last time. She had met Detective Bennett just a few blocks away, where they reviewed every detail of the plan, going over each step with precise instructions. She was supposed to act casual, sell another item, and wait for Robert to take possession of it. Only then would the detectives move in to arrest him. Detective Bennett handed her a tiny, barely noticeable microphone disguised as a clasp on the necklace she wore, and gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. You're doing a brave thing, Grace, Bennett said, her tone firm but warm. Just remember, we'll be right outside. The moment he takes possession, we'll come in. Grace nodded, grateful for the detective's support but unable to shake the nerves that clung to her. She reminded herself of why she was doing this. Robert Clark had exploited people like her, vulnerable and desperate, all for his own gain. She would be his last victim. As she approached the pawn shop, she took a deep breath and steadied herself. Opening the door, she stepped inside, her pulse quickening as she heard the familiar chime of the bell. The shop looked exactly as it had before, with its dim lighting and rows of glass cases filled with other people's stories. But today felt different. Today, she was the one with the upper hand, even if Robert didn't know it yet. Robert was behind the counter, watching her as she approached. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, and a predatory smile crept across his lips. Well, look who's back, he drawled, his eyes gleaming with that familiar cold calculation. Didn't think you had anything left to sell, Grace. She forced herself to look down, feigning vulnerability. I found one more thing, she murmured, sliding a small silver locket across the counter. It was something she had picked up at a second-hand store specifically for the operation. A small piece with little value, but enough for Robert to think she was desperate again. Robert picked up the locket, inspecting it closely, his fingers brushing over the clasp as he studied it with a hint of disdain. Family heirloom? He asked, his voice mocking. You know I can't pay much for sentimental value, he sneered. Grace fought back the urge to respond, keeping her face carefully neutral as she nodded. I understand, she replied, barely lifting her gaze. I just need whatever you can offer. He gave her a smug look, clearly pleased with her apparent desperation. I think I can make a deal, he said, his voice dripping with a fake sympathy she found nauseating. He reached into the register, pulling out a small wad of cash with deliberate slowness, savoring the moment. Grace's heart pounded as she watched him reach for the money. She was seconds away from Detective Bennett's promised intervention, but she couldn't help feeling trapped, wondering if somehow Robert would sense the trap and try to escape. But just as he began counting the bills onto the counter, the door burst open, and the pawn shop was suddenly filled with uniformed officers. Detective Bennett was at the front, her expression steely and unyielding. Robert Clark, you're under arrest for trafficking stolen goods, she declared, her voice carrying a commanding tone that left no room for argument. Robert froze, his face contorting with a mixture of confusion and fury as the officers closed in around him. What the hell is this? He barked, his eyes darting wildly around the room before settling on Grace with a look of venomous rage. You set me up, he snarled, realization dawning in his eyes. You think you can do this to me, Grace? Grace took a step back, her pulse racing, but she forced herself to stand her ground, refusing to be intimidated. I'm doing what you deserve, Robert, she replied, her voice shaking slightly but laced with conviction. You've taken advantage of people who had nothing, and now you'll face the consequences. Robert's expression twisted further as the officers restrained him, pulling his arms behind his back. You're going to pay for this, Grace, he spat, his voice low and seething. You have no idea what you've just started. But Grace held his gaze, refusing to let him see her fear. I'm not afraid of you anymore, she said, her voice steady. And for the first time, she realized she meant it. As the officers led him out of the shop, Detective Bennett approached Grace, offering her a small, approving nod. "You did well," Bennett said, her voice softening. "You've helped put an end to his operation. Thanks to you, Robert won't be preying on anyone else." A sense of relief washed over Grace, her shoulders relaxing for the first time since she'd entered the shop. She had finally taken a stand against someone who had tried to control her through fear and desperation, and she felt a weight lift from her heart that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Strich. Later that evening, Grace stayed late at the small cafe where she worked, her mind still replaying the events of the day. She felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration, the satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference tempered by the lingering tension from her confrontation with Robert. She had just finished wiping down the last table and was heading toward the back to lock up when she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind her. A chill ran down her spine as she turned slowly, her eyes widening when she saw Robert standing just inside the doorway. He must have been released on bail, but seeing him here, only hours after his arrest, felt surreal. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes dark and menacing as they fixed on her. "You think you're some kind of hero, Grace?" he sneered, his voice low and laced with venom. He took a step toward her, his expression filled with barely controlled rage. "Sticking your nose in my business? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Grace's heart hammered in her chest, and she took a step back, gripping her keys tightly in her hand as she searched for a way to escape. She forced herself to meet his gaze, though fear clenched in her throat. "I did what I had to," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "You've hurt people, Robert. You deserve to be held accountable." Robert's eyes narrowed, and he let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Accountable?" he sneered, shaking his head. "You think this ends here? You're naive, Grace. You're going to regret this." He took another step forward, and Grace felt panic rising, the exit feeling miles away. But before Robert could move closer, a figure appeared at the door behind him. It was Susan. She had come to meet Grace after her shift, sensing her friend might need support after everything that had happened. Her eyes instantly took in the situation, narrowing as she stepped forward, placing herself between Grace and Robert with a calm, fierce determination. "Leave her alone, Robert," Susan said, her voice cold and steady. "You have no business here, and you know it." Robert sneered, his eyes flicking between the two women, but he seemed to sense that he was outmatched. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice thick with malice. "You're going to regret crossing me, Grace. Just wait." With one last menacing glare, he turned and disappeared into the night, leaving a tense silence in his wake. Grace exhaled a shaky breath, relief flooding over her as Susan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, her presence grounding and protective. "He can't touch you, Grace," Susan said softly, giving her friend a reassuring squeeze. "You've got people who care about you now, people who won't let him hurt you." Grace nodded, feeling a rush of gratitude for her friend's support. But deep down, she knew that Robert's words weren't empty. She had challenged him, and his anger was far from resolved. With Robert's arrest, Ethan took no chances when it came to Grace's safety. He arranged for private security to monitor her home and her father's hospital room and insisted on daily check-ins. Grace's heart swelled with gratitude each time Ethan or Susan reminded her that she wasn't facing this alone. For years, she had been carrying so much on her own shoulders, but now, surrounded by those who cared about her, she began to feel something new, a tentative sense of freedom. With the immediate threat of Robert removed, Grace found herself with a rare, precious gift: time. Her father was finally receiving the treatment he needed, and Ethan's support had taken the weight of financial worry off her. For the first time, she was able to dream again, to consider things she had pushed aside for so long. One afternoon, Grace was sitting with Susan, tracing idle patterns on a notebook, when Susan noticed her distracted look. "All right, spill it," Susan said with a grin, nudging Grace's arm. "I know that look. What's going on in that head of yours?" Grace blushed, a shy smile breaking through. "It's just, I keep thinking about art, Susan. I haven't painted in years, but I can't stop thinking about it lately. I don't know, maybe it's silly." Susan's eyes lit up. "Silly? Grace, you're incredibly talented. You've always talked about wanting to paint. Why don't you start again? Actually, why don't you take a class?" Grace's eyes widened, the idea sparking something deep inside her. "You think so? A class?" She hadn't thought about formalizing her passion, but the idea was tempting. It would be nice to create something again. Susan gave her an enthusiastic nod. Yes. Do it. Life is finally giving you some space, Grace. You deserve this. You should absolutely go for it. Encouraged by Susan's unwavering support, Grace went home that night and searched for local art courses, her heart pounding with a mix of excitement and nerves. She found a class that focused on painting and was led by a well-respected local artist. Without overthinking it, she signed up, feeling an exhilarating sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. Strich. A few weeks later, Grace stood in the art studio, a blank canvas in front of her. She felt the familiar thrill as she dipped her brush in the paint, letting her instincts take over. Each stroke brought memories and emotions to the surface, feelings she hadn't let herself process until now. She poured her struggles, hopes, and gratitude into her work, and with each session, she felt herself healing a little more. One piece, in particular, had her returning to it time and time again. She had named it Hope, a painting that captured the resilience, strength, and love she had rediscovered in her journey. The background was dark and textured, representing the difficulties she had faced, while in the center, a soft light emerged, illuminating a figure reaching forward. It was both a reflection of her past and a vision of the brighter future she finally believed was possible. The instructor noticed her dedication to the piece, encouraging her to exhibit it at the upcoming gallery showcase. Grace hesitated at first, feeling vulnerable at the thought of sharing something so personal, but the instructor's words echoed in her mind. Art is most powerful when it tells a story. You have something to say, Grace. When the night of the exhibit arrived, Grace found herself nervous but determined as she watched people milling around her piece, studying it, interpreting it. Susan and Ethan were there, both glowing with pride, and her father, though too weak to attend, had insisted on seeing photos of her work. As Grace stood by her painting, a familiar face approached her, Michael Turner, the lawyer who had first introduced her to Ethan. He looked over her painting, his expression one of admiration. "Grace, this is truly remarkable," he said, meeting her eyes with a kind smile. "You have a gift. You should be showing this to more people." Grace blushed, humbled by his praise. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. I didn't realize how much I needed this until now. Painting again feels like coming back to myself." Linda, who had accompanied Michael to the gallery, stepped forward, her gaze warm and thoughtful. "Grace, have you ever thought about doing a charity exhibition?" she suggested. "An event where you could display your art while supporting a cause that's meaningful to you?" Grace's eyes lit up at the idea, her mind racing. A charity exhibition would allow her to give back to the people who had supported her in her darkest days. The idea ignited a spark within her. "I love that idea, Linda," she replied, her voice filled with excitement. "Giving back feels right. After everything I've been through, it feels like the best way to honor all the help I've received." Linda smiled, and Michael nodded in agreement. "I'd be happy to help you organize it," he said. "We could reach out to local venues, put together a fundraiser, and find a way to support other families facing difficult times." Grace felt a warmth spread through her as she looked around at her friends, her newfound family. The gallery exhibit, the charity idea, it all felt like more than just dreams. It was the beginning of something new, a path she hadn't dared to imagine before but was finally ready to pursue. The night of the charity auction had arrived, and the room was filled with family, friends, and supporters who had been touched by Grace's journey. Her paintings, displayed across the elegant gallery, captured raw emotions of resilience, hope, and love. Each piece represented a fragment of her story, and as she moved through the crowd, she was greeted by warm smiles, encouraging nods, and heartfelt compliments. Detective Laura Bennett, who had become more than just an ally over the months, approached her, pride shining in her eyes. "Grace," she said with a genuine smile, "your courage and willingness to help brought down a network that had been preying on the vulnerable for years. You were the key we needed." Grace felt a warmth spread through her, and she gave Laura a grateful smile. "Thank you, Detective. It's strange to think that something as painful as all of this led to something so fulfilling. But I wouldn't have made it without you and everyone else." Her gaze drifted to Ethan, who was mingling with the guests but kept glancing back at her, as if to make sure she was all right. At the sound of a spoon tapping a glass, the room fell silent, and Ethan stepped forward, lifting his glass. "To Grace," he said, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "A woman who brought strength and love into all our lives. She turned her pain into purpose, showing us what true resilience looks like." The guests raised their glasses, and a chorus of "To Grace" filled the room. Grace blushed, humbled by the attention, but her heart was full. It felt surreal to be surrounded by so much love and support after so many years of struggle. The evening continued with the auction, each of her paintings drawing in more bids than she had dared to hope. With each bid, she felt her dream of giving back to those who needed it most become more of a reality. After the final painting was sold, the evening turned into a celebration, filled with laughter, music, and the warmth of companionship. It was a night that Grace knew she would carry with her forever. Later, as the crowd began to thin, Grace found herself alone with Ethan in a quiet corner of the gallery. They stood side by side, taking in the evening's success, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Grace turned to him, her voice filled with emotion. "Ethan, I don't think I can ever thank you enough," she said softly. "For everything. You coming into my life. It changed everything." Ethan's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, holding it gently. "Grace, finding you felt like finding something I didn't even know I was missing. We saved more than just a family legacy. We found each other." He paused, glancing around at the remnants of the evening's success. "I've been thinking, Grace. What if we made this into something lasting? A foundation, to help others who are in situations like the one you faced." Grace's eyes lit up, her pulse quickening with excitement. "A foundation," she echoed, her mind racing with the possibilities. "Yes, Ethan. That's perfect. We could reach so many families, give them the hope that I found with your help." With that, the idea for the Miller Anderson Foundation was born. It would be dedicated to supporting families facing severe financial and medical crises. Grace felt an overwhelming sense of purpose as they spoke, knowing that this would be a chance to turn her struggles into something that could make a difference. In the weeks that followed, the foundation took shape, with Grace pouring her energy into creating something that would provide lasting support for those in need. She drew strength from her friends and family, each of them becoming an essential part of the initiative. Susan, her constant source of encouragement, joined as a coordinator, using her compassion and warmth to reach those in need. Michael Turner offered his legal expertise, guiding the foundation through its establishment, while Linda provided organizational support, helping Grace manage everything from events to outreach. Dr. Harris, who had been there for her father from the start, became a partner in the foundation's medical support efforts, offering his network and resources to families without access to care. Even Detective Bennett became involved, using her position to connect the foundation with community programs and ensuring that those in the most difficult circumstances could find a path forward. One evening, as Grace and Ethan reviewed their plans for the foundation's official launch, John Miller joined them, sitting quietly as they finalized their vision. He watched his daughter with pride, his face softened with admiration. "Grace," he said, his voice full of emotion, "your mother would be so proud of you." "I am." Grace moved to her father's side, wrapping him in a gentle hug. "This isn't just for me, Dad," she said softly, her voice catching. "It's because of the love and support I received from you and everyone around me. I want to be that support for others now." The foundation's opening ceremony was a deeply emotional day. Grace, standing at the podium before a crowd filled with friends, family, and supporters, took a deep breath, looking out at the faces who had been with her through every challenge. She found Ethan in the audience and smiled, feeling a profound sense of peace. With a steady voice, she addressed the crowd. "All of us face challenges that at times feel insurmountable," she began. "But it's the love and support we receive that defines how we overcome them. This foundation is built on that support, a lifeline for those who feel like there's no way out." Ethan gave her an encouraging nod, his eyes reflecting the pride and admiration he felt for her. Grace felt a renewed confidence, knowing that together, they could face whatever the future held. The Miller Anderson Foundation was more than just an organization. It was a testament to resilience, love, and the strength found in unity. As Grace stood surrounded by her friends, her family, and a community bound by compassion, she knew that her journey had only just begun.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.